The patrol car rolled slowly through the sleeping streets of the provincial town. It had been a boring evening, the usual routine of stopped cars, a couple of minor infractions, and chatter on the radio. The two cops, Officer Steve Hudson and his partner Jack Carter, made no secret of their annoyance. Working in such a quiet neighborhood had long been boring, and they felt like they were wasting their energy. "Boring," Steve muttered, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. "When is something interesting going to happen?" Jack grinned, watching the empty sidewalks. "Maybe we'll find someone disruptive. Cheer ourselves up." As if on cue, a man appeared from around the corner. Tall, dark-skinned, in a simple but neat suit, he walked with a straight back and a briefcase in his hand. His confident gait seemed to irritate the officers at once. "Look at that," Jack grinned. "There's our candidate. What's he doing here in the middle of the night? Why don't we check it out?" Steve swerved to the sidewalk and turned on his blinker. The man stopped, looking at the police officers with slight bewilderment, but no fear. His calmness only encouraged the officers. "Hey, you!" Steve shouted, getting out of the car. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "Good evening, officers," the man replied calmly. "I'm just coming back from work. Is something wrong?" Jack smirked, looking at the briefcase appraisingly. "From work, you say? Isn't it a little late for honest labor?" Steve stepped closer, looking the man straight in the eye. His tone became cold and prickly. "Do you have your ID on you, or do we need to find out who you are?" The man held his gaze, pulling his passport out of his pocket. He could feel the atmosphere growing hotter by the second. "Here, my paperwork. I hope this helps." But the officers didn't even look at them. Instead, Steve snatched the briefcase from the man's hands and opened it, dumping the contents onto the hood of the car. "Look at that, Jack. Papers," he grinned. "I thought we'd find something more interesting." "Maybe he's got something else stashed away," Jack added, searching the man's pockets. The man frowned, but didn't resist. "This is a violation of my rights. Do you have a warrant?" "Warrant?" Steve laughed. "Look, you're not in court here. You're in our neighborhood, and we decide what's legal here." The two of them laughed loudly, as if they had just heard the funniest joke. "You know what, Jack?" Steve said, his eyes glinting with gloating. "Why don't we have some fun? It's been a long time since we've had fun." Their decision was made in seconds. Jack pointed to an old stray dog cage that stood outside an empty building. It hadn't been used in a long time, rusty and dirty. "Here, this is the place for it," Jack offered with a smirk. The man raised an eyebrow, his calmness beginning to fade. "You can't do that. It's illegal." "Illegal?" Steve interjected, rolling his eyes. "Who's the law here, smart-ass?" Forcing the man into the cage, they slammed the door shut. The loud rattle of the rusty lock broke the silence of the night. "Welcome to your new place," Jack said mockingly, tapping the metal bars with his baton. The man sitting on the floor of the cage looked at them silently. His gaze was strangely confident, calm. It was beginning to worry Steve. "Why don't you scream? You're not trying to get away," he asked, chuckling nervously. The man only grinned slightly. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Those words hung in the air, suddenly adding to the oppressive tension. The officers' laughter died down, leaving a silence behind them. This was the beginning of their nightmare. Steve and Jack stood by the cage, casting derisive glances at the man. They felt like the heroes of the evening, as if they'd just put down someone who dared to look too confident in their territory. The man, sitting on the dirty floor of the cage, continued to watch them in silence. His silence irritated them. "So, what do you think, boy?" Jack began, leaning closer to the cage. "Comfortable? I hope we've got you in a place that's right for you?" Steve laughed, playing along with his partner. "I think it's the best lodging he's seen in his entire life. Isn't it?" The man didn't answer, only raised an eyebrow slightly. His silence pissed Steve off. He wanted a reaction, fear, anger, something to confirm his superiority. "Oh, look how important you are. You think you're better than us?" Steve hit the metal bars of the cage with his baton. A loud sound broke the silence of the night. "You're nothing, okay? You're nobody." Jack smirked and began strutting around the cage like a predator around its prey. "Maybe he doesn't understand us, Steve. Maybe we should talk slower." He stretched out the words. "You're here because you're nobody." Steve laughed out loud. "Jack, maybe he's the kind of guy who's used to talking by his rights. Thinks his rights mean something around here." "You mean the driver's license?" Jack picked up, stopping at the cage door. "Here's my license." He patted the badge on his uniform defiantly. "That's all that matters here." The man finally spoke. His voice was calm, but with a tinge of latent power. "You're abusing your power. There will be consequences." Steve flinched, but immediately grinned secretly. "Consequences?" His voice became mocking. "And who's going to provide them? You? Look at you. You're in a cage and we're outside." Jack leaned closer. "We're the ones who keep order here, and you're just another—" He paused, choosing the word. "A trespasser who got what he deserved. Or thinks he has," Steve added. "Because if you keep looking at us like that, we'll show you what real order is." "That's right, Steve," Jack grinned. "But why don't we play before we do that? Let him feel what it's like to be where he belongs." They began to mock openly. They told humiliating jokes, recalled stereotypes, ridiculed the man's clothes, his calmness, even the color of his skin. "You know what's funny?" Jack started, smiling. "You think that suit of yours makes you one of us? No, boy. You'll never be our equal." Steve stepped closer, holding a bottle of water. "You might be thirsty." "Oh, but I'm sorry. I think I spilled it." He deliberately poured the water over the grate, almost hitting the man in the face. The man didn't even flinch. His eyes still looked calmly at the officers, which only fueled their aggression more. "What are you looking at?" Steve exploded, hitting the cage again. "You think you're better than us? Tell me, who are you, you goddamn imposter?" The man only grinned. "You'll find out soon enough." Steve and Jack looked at each other. The man's confidence was beginning to worry them, but they brushed the doubts aside. "All right, let him sit. The morning will tell who's in charge," Jack said as he headed for the car. "Yeah, let him think about his behavior." Steve picked up on that, throwing the man one last mocking glance. But their fun began to fade. They did not yet know that their first joke had already set off a chain of events that would change their lives forever. The dim light of a street lamp illuminated an abandoned parking lot where stood an old rusty cage once used for stray dogs. Officers, Steve and Jack, looked at each other, grinning as if they'd just made the most brilliant joke of their lives. "So, our dear righteous man, how do you like your new place?" Steve said wryly, slamming the rusty cage door shut with a rattle that shattered the silence of the night. The man sat silently on the cold floor, holding onto the metal bars that smelled of rust and urine. His confident gaze didn't waver, which irritated the police even more. "Hey, Jack, Do you think his ancestors felt the same way when they were carried across the ocean? Steve threw in a barbed quip, eliciting a loud laugh from his partner. Oh, I'm sure he's at home. Maybe he'll sing us a song too, to make the atmosphere real, Jack said, pretending to drum on the cage like a drum. They were savoring the moment. The phone camera flashed, illuminating the man's face as Jack snapped a few pictures. Now we're going to be stars for sure, Jack said, looking at the pictures. Which do you think is a better caption? Real Order or Parenting Masterclass? Steve laughed, wiping away tears of laughter. Caption it, "This is why they're out of place. People will appreciate the humor." The man didn't say a word, but his calmness only added more fuel to the fire. "Why don't you say something?" Steve shouted, leaning against the bars of the cage. "What, you got a mouth on you? Or do you think your arrogance is going to stop us?" Jack raised his baton, tapping it against the cage. Maybe he thinks we're impressed with his suit or his briefcase. He spit next to the cage. "You're just trash to us, okay?" Steve pulled out a thermos and opened the lid, hot steam wafting from it. He took a sip and exhaled loudly. "Hey, you want some?" "Oh, that's right. We don't serve people like you here." "What's that look?" Jack suddenly shouted, slamming his baton into the cage so hard that the metal jingled. "You think you're better than us? You're nothing. No one here will even remember you when we're done with you." Steve, lips pursed mockingly, pretended to think about it. "You know, maybe he's not talking because his masters won't let him talk." "Right," Jack grinned. "It's just a dog, not a person." Their words sounded more and more humiliating, the cruelty escalating into outright racism. Jack pulled out his phone again and turned on the recording. "Hey, say something, our prisoner. Come on, tell the audience what it's like to sit where you're always supposed to be." The man raised his eyes and looked directly into the camera. His calm voice sounded unexpectedly firm. "You have no idea what you just did." Jack put the phone down, not expecting such a response. "Are you threatening us?" he hissed, frowning. "I'm warning you," the man replied briefly. Steve suddenly felt a slight chill run down his back, but he brushed it off. "Fuck you," he said, hitting the bars with his baton. "We're the authorities here, and no one can help you." The man didn't answer, but his gaze left a strange feeling, as if they had already lost, though they hadn't realized it yet. The officers, chuckling, got into the car, leaving the man in the cage. Jack turned on the radio and cracked another joke. "Can you imagine how he'll cry when they find him?" Steve chuckled, but in the back of his mind he was beginning to doubt whether this joke was such a good idea. The night grew quieter and quieter, and only the rusted bars of the cage creaked in the wind, hiding the truth of what would soon fall upon their lives. The wind picked up, making the old chains on the cage rattle melodiously. The policemen, sitting in their patrol car, glanced occasionally at the man, who seemed to feel no humiliation at all. He sat with a straight back, looking at them with a slight half-smile, as if they were the ones trapped, not him. "Why is he sitting so still, Steve?" Jack asked, frowning at the man's silhouette. "Usually, they start begging for mercy." "Maybe he's just stubborn." Steve dismissed him, though he felt a twinge of unease inside. "Or maybe he doesn't realize what we'll do to him if he doesn't respect us." Jack grinned and got out of the car, slamming the door loudly. He walked over to the cage and stood in front of the man, arms crossed over his chest. "Well, why are you silent, great hero? Or do you think we'll leave you here forever? Speak when you're spoken to." The man looked up at him. His voice was quiet but confident. You're very much speaking for people who have already made their biggest mistake." Jack frowned. That answer hurt him more than he'd expected. "Mistake?" he questioned, squeezing the baton in his hand. "The mistake was not showing you your place sooner." Steve, joining his partner, stood beside him, trying to hide his own anxiety. "You're brave for a man locked in a cage. Do you realize that you are at the complete mercy of those in front of you?" The man tilted his head slightly, his voice sounding firmer. "You think I'm in a cage?" "No, gentlemen, you're the one who's trapped." Jack clenched his fists, his face flaring with irritation. "A trap?" He laughed out loud. "You probably don't realize who you're dealing with." The man paused, his gaze penetrating the police officers' souls. "On the contrary, you're the one who doesn't realize who you're dealing with." Steve felt goosebumps run down his skin. Something in the man's voice was frightening. He remembered how the man had reacted calmly to the humiliation, to the bludgeoning on the cage, to the taunts. It was wrong. Anyone else would have begged for their release by now, but this man, he sat there as if he were in control of the situation. "You talk too much," Steve said, trying to sound calm. "Need I remind you who decides?" "Remind me as much as you want," the man replied with a slight smile. "It won't change what happens next." "What's going to happen?" Jack asked mockingly, leaning closer. "You'll see," the man replied calmly, "but I warn you, it will hurt." Steve couldn't take it any more. He struck the bars of the cage with his baton, causing a loud metallic clang. "You don't seem to understand how this works. We're the power here, and you're nobody. And if you think anyone is going to come to your rescue, you are sorely mistaken." The man slowly rose to his feet, his figure now towering behind the bars. Even in this cage, he looked imposing. "You think you have power, but your power is based on fear and force. Now imagine what happens when those things disappear." Jack felt the man's words make him uneasy, but he suppressed it at once. "That's it. I'm sick of this," he muttered, grabbing the keys to the cage. Steve stopped him. "Don't, Jack. It's just another smart guy. He's going to fool us, and then he's going to break himself." But Jack wasn't so sure. The man's calmness was beginning to cause not only irritation, but fear. They couldn't understand how he could be so sure. The man sat up again, resuming his previous posture. "Time will tell which of us was right," he said quietly, looking out into the darkness of the night. And there was something about that silence that made Steve and Jack quickly get back in the car to avoid looking into his eyes. Steve sat in the patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. There was something about their prisoner's behavior that made him uneasy. The man hadn't asked for mercy, hadn't screamed, hadn't tried to threaten them directly. He seemed to know that the outcome was already decided. "Look, Jack, did you check his papers properly?" Steve finally asked, frowning. Jack, lying back in his seat and happily listening to the radio, waved his hand lazily. "What's there to check? Just another smart guy. He might even have a fake ID. Why do you even bother?" Steve sighed and picked up the papers lying on the dashboard. A passport, a building pass, and a business card. He froze as his gaze fell on the gold logo on the business card. Federal Commission on Human Rights. "Hey, Jack," he muttered, feeling cold sweat start to run down his back. "Did you see that?" Jack lifted his head, glancing at his partner unhappily. "What?" Steve held out a business card to him. Jack took it with a mocking smile, but his expression quickly changed to alarm. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked hoarsely. Steve flipped through the passport without taking his eyes off the documents. It had the man's name and title in black and white: Julian Bryant, Federal Inspector of Human Rights. "No, Jack, this isn't a joke," he replied in a shaky voice. They glanced over at each other. Jack whined, grabbing his head. "We're screwed, Steve. God damn it, we're in trouble." "Quiet," Steve hissed, though he was on the verge of panic himself. "Maybe it's fake. Maybe he's just trying to scare us." "Are you serious?" Jack pointed to the coat of arms and watermark on the papers. "Those are real papers. If this gets out, we'll be torn to pieces." Steve glanced at the cage where the man still sat calmly with his arms folded. His expression was unchanged, as if he knew this moment would come. "What do we do?" Jack whispered, visibly nervous. Steve felt fear begin to take over him. They had overstepped their bounds. They hadn't just humiliated a man, they had humiliated a federal inspector, a man who could not just take away their jobs but ruin their entire lives. We should let him go," Steve finally muttered. "Let's say it was a mistake." "A mistake?" Jack laughed, but there was no joy in that laugh. "You think he'll take it? That guy's going to eat us alive as soon as he gets out of the cage." "Then maybe we don't let him out?" Steve's voice became hoarse. Jack froze, looking at his partner. "Are you suggesting that take him out?" Steve looked away, feeling panic rising inside him. "I don't know, but he knows too much, if he talks about it." Jack got out of the car, slamming the door so that it shuddered. He walked over to the cage, trying to look confident, but he was shaken inside. "Hey," he said, looking at the man. "You, Inspector or whatever, listen to me. We can make a deal." The man looked up, and his calmness brought Jack out of his thoughts again. "Make a deal?" Julian said quietly. "After what you did?" "Listen," Jack leaned closer. "You realize that if this gets out, it'll ruin our lives." Julian grinned, shaking his head slightly. "Were you thinking about my life when you put me in this cage?" Steve, watching from the car, sensed the situation was getting out of hand. He ran outside to join his partner. "Look," he began, "we can solve this peacefully. You get out, we forget everything that happened." "Forget?" Julian stood up, his voice firmer. "You're the one who wants to forget, but I won't forget, and I won't let you forget." Steve and Jack stared at him in silence, feeling their control of the situation slipping away. They realized that the nightmare was just beginning. Steve and Jack sat in the patrol car, the silence between them almost palpable. Jack was nervously rubbing the cell phone they'd recently used to take pictures and videos. He was pale, sweat dripping down his temples. "We have a problem, Steve." He finally broke the silence. "Big problems." Steve nodded silently, gripping the steering wheel so hard his fingers turned white. "The pictures," Jack said suddenly, as if he'd had an epiphany. "They have to be deleted, every single one of them." He immediately began flipping through the gallery, erasing the pictures that had made him laugh a few hours ago. Now they looked like evidence of a crime that could destroy their lives. "Video, too," Steve mumbled, glancing at his partner's phone. "If any of it gets anywhere, we're dead." "I'm removing it now." Jack was almost shouting, his fingers trembling, but the pictures and video were just the beginning. Steve pulled out his walkie-talkie and looked at it thoughtfully. "We have to pretend this never happened. No detention, no cage, no nothing." "What about him?" Jack pointed to the cage where Julian sat, calmly watching them. His calmness only added to the tension. With him, Steve was silent, clearly afraid to say what was running through his head. Why don't we, intimidate him? Convince him not to talk. Do you think he'll be scared? Jack laughed hoarsely. Did you see him? That guy's looking at us like he's already written our sentence. Steve sighed heavily, looked at the radio again, then at his partner. Then, we need to make sure he shuts up. Forever. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jack looked at Steve with horror. Are you suggesting killing him? Steve averted his gaze, looking somewhere off to the side. If he comes out of here and tells, we lose everything. Our badges, our careers, our lives. Jack frowned, but remained silent. He realized that Steve was right. The only way to protect himself was to remove the witness. But how? He finally asked. We don't even know where to do it, so no one will find the body. Steve began to walk around the car, thinking through the plan. There are too many cameras here, he muttered. We should take him farther away, somewhere in the woods. We can do it there. Jack felt the cold sweat rise again on his forehead. What if someone sees us? We'll do this quietly. Steve turned sharply to his partner. Do you want your life to end because of him? Jack looked at Julian. He was still sitting still, as if he understood every word they were saying. Do you think he's guessing? Jack whispered. Of course he does, Steve swore. The bastard must be savoring every moment. They looked at each other, their gazes full of fear and hatred. Steve turned back to the car, pulled out his phone and began deleting calls, messages, anything that might connect them to the incident. The walkie-talkie needs to be erased too, he muttered. And the camera in the parking lot? Jack stood up abruptly, his voice trembling. Damn it, Steve. There are cameras in there. I know. Steve grabbed his head. We'll clean up the tape in the morning, before anyone notices. It was at this time that Julian finally spoke. His voice cut through the silence of the night like a knife. You think you're destroying your tracks? Steve and Jack turned toward the cage at the same time, their faces pale. You erase pictures, records, but your greatest proof is yourself, Julian continued calmly. Shut up, Jack shouted, hitting the bars of the cage with his baton. But Julian didn't stop. You've already lost. The more you try to hide your actions, the deeper you sink into this pit. Steve stepped closer, his face twisted with anger and fear. You don't know what you're saying. We can shut you up. Julian smiled, and there was something in his eyes that made the police officers freeze. Try it, he said quietly. See what happens. Steve and Jack backed away. Fear had now taken over them completely. Julian was right. Their fear and paranoia had already begun to destroy them from the inside out. The cage rang with the wind that swayed its rusty chains, but Julian Bryant remained motionless. His calmness had a worse effect on Steve and Jack than any scream. Every time they tried to humiliate him, to break him, to make him show fear, he only glared at them with that icy stare that now wouldn't leave their minds. Jack peered nervously into the cage again. Why is he so calm? He whispered. Steve lit a cigarette without answering. His hands were shaking and he tried to look confident, but Julian's words were still echoing in his head. The more you try to hide your actions, the deeper you sink into this hole. Maybe he's waiting for someone, Jack continued, losing patience. Do you think he has time to tell anyone? Steve hesitated, considering his partner's words. He realized that Julian hadn't said anything unnecessary, but his confidence hinted that he knew something, that he had something up his sleeve. "His phone," Steve said. "What? Where's his phone, Jack? Did we take it or leave it?" Jack stared stunned at his partner. "Shit," he exhaled. "I didn't check." They rushed to the cage. Jack swung the door open roughly, grabbed Julian by the collar, and pulled him out of the cage, throwing him to the ground. "Where's your phone?" he growled. Julian slowly raised his eyes to the officer, his face remaining remarkably calm. "I think you know where he is." Steve gritted his teeth. "You sent something, didn't you? Did you sign us up?" Julian didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, brushing dirt off his pants as if nothing had happened. That calm was driving them crazy. "Answer me, damn you!" Jack swung his baton, but Steve grabbed his arm. "Stop," he whispered. "Why?" Jack shouted. "He's playing with us. He knows something." "Exactly," Julian said, interrupting their argument. His voice was quiet, but it penetrated their minds like an icy spike. "I know a lot of things, more than you think." "Shut up," shouted Steve, but Julian continued as if he hadn't heard him. "I know you're already panicking. Your actions say more than your words. You're erasing photos, deleting records, but it doesn't matter. Everything you've done has already been recorded." Jack turned pale. "What are you talking about?" "Cameras." Julian nodded slightly toward the abandoned parking lot. "You didn't even check to see if the surveillance system was working." Steve turned sharply toward the cameras. They looked old, but he couldn't be sure now that they weren't functioning. "You're bluffing," he muttered, but his voice shook. Julian smiled. "See if you can find out." Jack grabbed the radio, trying to call dispatch, but Julian spoke again. "Even if the cameras don't work, it doesn't change the point. You left traces. Your voices, your actions. You think they're that easy to erase?" Steve reprimanded, grabbing him by the collar. "What did you do? Tell me." "It's okay. Bye." Julian spoke calmly, looking him straight in the eye. "But you might want to think about what's going to happen when I get out of here." "You're not getting out," Steve hissed, clenching his fists. "Are you sure?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure I haven't had time to pass on the information? That no one knows where I am?" Jack felt the cold sweat roll down his neck again. "We have to stop him, Steve. We have to do something right now. Do you really think this is the way out?" Julian spoke louder, his voice full of confidence. "You kill me, and then what? Someone will notice my disappearance. People will start asking questions, and the answers will lead to you." Steve let go of him, taking a step back. 1,000 thoughts swirled in his head, but none of them seemed like salvation. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "Justice," Julian replied briefly. "What the hell kind of justice?" Jack shouted. Julian looked at them, his gaze cold and hard. "One that makes you realize you're not above the law." At that moment, both officers realized that their game was over. Julian was no longer their victim. He was now their judge. Steve and Jack were silent, sitting in the patrol car parked next to the cage. Their usually confident and brazen faces now expressed only fear and confusion. Julian, sitting inside the rusted structure, looked like he was already one step ahead. His calmness had become unbearable to them. "We're screwed, Steve," Jack finally whispered, looking down at his trembling hands. "We're in a hell of a mess." "Shut up," Steve barked, clutching the steering wheel. "I'm thinking." But his thoughts were chaotic. They had ruined their careers and possibly their lives for one joke. Now, this man, their victim, was turning the situation upside down, making them feel cornered. "What are we gonna do?" Jack wouldn't stop. Steve exhaled heavily, looking at the phone. "We have two choices. Either we find a way to silence him or he destroys us." Jack laughed nervously. "And how do you propose to do that? Kill him?" That would only prove he was right. Steve fell silent again, his thoughts growing darker and darker. "Why don't we try to get a confession out of him?" he finally suggested. "A confession to what?" Jack asked skeptically. "That he provoked us? That it's his fault?" Jack looked at his partner as if he couldn't believe his ears. "Steve, are you even listening to yourself? This guy obviously knows how to turn the tables on us." Steve didn't answer. He knew Jack was right, but he had no other plan. Meanwhile, Julian in the cage was contemplating what was happening. The two men were clearly broken. He knew how fear worked and realized that their panic would increase with each passing minute. His weapon of choice was their own weaknesses. "Interesting choice, gentlemen," he finally said loudly so their voices couldn't be ignored. Steve and Jack turned around in sync. "What else?" Steve threw in, trying to sound confident, but his voice shook. "Are you trying to decide how to cover your tracks?" Julian rose slowly, his figure behind the bars of the cage looking imposing. "Or have you already concluded that it's impossible?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Steve replied sharply. "On the contrary," Julian continued calmly, "I know exactly what I'm talking about. Your fear makes you predictable." "We're not afraid," Jack said, but his trembling hands gave him away. "No?" Julian grinned slightly. "Then why haven't you called for backup yet? Why haven't you informed your superiors? Because you realize that once the truth comes out, your power will be gone." Steve slapped the steering wheel in desperation. "Stop playing with us." But Julian didn't stop. "I've already told you everything that happened," he said suddenly. "What?" Steve turned around sharply. "My phone was on the whole time. The recording's been sent." Jack turned pale. "You're lying." "Try to find out," Julian replied calmly. Steve and Jack got out of the car. Their faces were contorted with anger and fear. "You didn't send anything," Steve said, grabbing Julian by the collar. "If you had, we'd be in custody by now." "Maybe," Julian answered, holding his gaze. "Or maybe this is just the beginning." Jack grabbed the baton, his nerves failing him. "He's playing with us. We have to break him." "Jack, stop!" Steve tried to stop him, but it was too late. Jack swung, but Julian ducked, his calm suddenly replaced by lightning-fast reaction. He caught the baton and yanked it out of his partner's hands. "You should be more careful," he said quietly, pointing his baton to the side. Jack backed away, his eyes full of fear. What are you doing?" "I remind you that strength without control is weakness," Julian replied. Steve, looking at this scene, realized that they had already lost. Julian had not broken, and they had become victims of their own fear and arrogance. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "Justice," Julian said firmly. "Not just for me, but for those you humiliated before me." Steve realized that it was useless to resist. Now, all they had to do was wait. Julian was slowly destroying them from the inside, turning their self-confidence into ash. They didn't know what would happen next, but they were sure of one thing. Their power no longer meant anything. The night was thickening, but for Steve and Jack, it felt endless. Every hour they spent in the abandoned parking lot felt like a year. Julian didn't speak anymore. He sat in his cage like a predator waiting for the moment to strike the final blow. But his silence was far worse than words. In the car, Steve was nervously flipping through his walkie-talkie, trying to find some sort of foothold. Jack was clutching his phone, making sure for the umpteenth time that all the photos and videos had been erased. "We have to do something," Jack muttered. "Like what?" Steve answered sharply, not taking his eyes off the walkie-talkie. "To tell the superiors that we accidentally put the human rights inspector in a cage and humiliated him." "Better that than—" Jack started, but stopped talking when a new call appeared on the radio display. "Station 23, status report. We've received a missing persons report on Federal Inspector Julian Bryant. He was last seen in your neighborhood. Do you copy?" The blood rushed from the policemen's faces. Steve grabbed the walkie-talkie, muting it. "Shit," he cursed. "They know, Steve," Jack whispered. "They're already looking for him." Steve was breathing heavily, contemplating what to do. "We need time. If we respond now, we're screwed. And if we don't, they'll come looking for us." Jack looked on the verge of hysterics, but Julian, hearing this challenge, only chuckled slightly. "See?" he said, his voice unexpectedly loud in the tense silence. The truth was beginning to emerge. Steve got out of the car, heading toward the cage. His face was red with rage. "You think you've won, don't you? But you have no idea what we're willing to do to save our lives." Julian rose slowly, his figure looking imposing even behind the bars of the cage. "Me?" He raised an eyebrow. "You did it all yourself, or have you forgotten that I'm not the first person you've humiliated?" "What do you mean?" Jack asked, getting out of the car. "Your jokes," Julian said coldly. "Your ways of showing power. Do you think it went unnoticed?" Steve frowned. "You're bluffing." "Bluffing?" Julian grinned. "Then why do you have the most complaints against you for abuse of authority in your precinct? Why are your actions frowned upon even by your colleagues?" "It's a rumor," Jack said sharply, his voice shaking. "Rumors?" Julian took a step closer to the bars. "I've done my homework, gentlemen. Your records speak for themselves. Threatening teenagers, attacking homeless people, falsifying reports." Steve froze. He suddenly remembered how, a few months ago, one of the officers in the department had hinted that their actions had drawn the attention of an internal investigation. He hadn't paid much attention to it then, but now he realized that it was the beginning of the end. "You're just playing with us," he muttered, though there was no confidence in his voice. "If I'm playing, why are you afraid?" Julian asked quietly. Jack couldn't stand it. "He's threatening us. We have to take him out right now." "Shut up." Steve grabbed his partner's shoulder. "Take him out. And then what? You think that's going to stop everything?" Jack lashed out, his eyes filled with rage. "What do you think we should do? Wait for him to turn us in?" Julian, watching their argument, realized that the crack between them was getting deeper. "You think you're going to kill me and this will all be over?" he said calmly. "On the contrary, it will be the beginning." Steve frowned. "What do you mean?" "You know who I am." Julian sat down again, folding his hands in his lap. "But you don't know that I was here for a reason." "What?" Jack exhaled. "I was sent here on your business," Julian said, his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Your superiors have known about your behavior for a long time. They asked me to gather evidence." Steve turned pale. His feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. "You're lying." "The truth has already begun to emerge," Julian repeated. "Even if I disappeared, the data would remain. And then you'd both become not just criminals, but a symbol of a rotten system." Jack fell to his knees, clutching his head. "It's over, Steve. We've lost." Steve looked at his partner and then at Julian. His world was crumbling. The power games he'd enjoyed for years were now turning against him. But deep down, he realized that Julian wasn't their enemy. The real enemy was their own pride, which had turned them into monsters. Now, all they had to do was wait for the inevitable. The sound of police sirens cut through the silence of the night, breaking the tension that enveloped the abandoned parking lot. Steve and Jack stood by their patrol car, frozen in anticipation of the end. Their eyes were full of terror and confusion, and their hands trembled with fear. In the distance, the headlights of other cars were approaching. "They know," Jack whispered, his voice filled with despair. "This is the end." "Not now." Steve exhaled, but his confidence melted away like smoke. "We can still get out of this." Julian sat in the cage, motionless, but his gaze was directed straight at them. This man was no longer their victim. He had become a judge, ready to pass judgment. The cars stopped and the officers poured out of them. Among them were their colleagues and a deputy sheriff. There was a look of bewilderment and anxiety on their faces. "What's going on here?" the deputy sheriff asked loudly, surveying the scene. The two nervous police officers, the man in the cage, and the general disarray. Steve stepped forward, trying to remain calm. It's a misunderstanding, sir. We detained him for suspicious behavior." "Suspicious behavior?" The deputy sheriff stepped closer to the cage, frowning. His gaze fell on Julian, and he recognized him instantly. "It's Federal Inspector Bryant." Everyone froze. A few of the officers looked at each other, and Jack covered his face with his hands. "Explain what he's doing in the cage, officers." The deputy's voice became harsh. "He fought back," Steve started to say, but was interrupted by Julian's voice. "They've decided that their power allows them to do whatever they want," the inspector said. His voice was calm but powerful. "And they turned it into their own personal entertainment." The deputy sheriff turned to Steve and Jack. "Is that true?" "He's lying," Jack shouted. "He was provoking us." But Jack's words sounded weak against Julian's confident calm. "The cameras in this parking lot recorded everything," the inspector added. "If in doubt, check the footage." The deputy gestured to one of the officers to check the cells. Meanwhile, the others surrounded Steve and Jack, their faces a mixture of disgust and rage. The camera footage was a turning point. The screen showed Steve and Jack insulting Julian, laughing, taking pictures of him, humiliating him. Their every gesture, every word was proof of their guilt. When the recording ended, silence enveloped the entire station. Steve and Jack stared at the screen, realizing that their fate was now sealed. "You're both under arrest for abuse of authority, unlawful detention, and human rights violations," the deputy sheriff said in a cold voice. Steve tried to object, but the words stuck in his throat. Jack fell to his knees as if broken. Julian stepped out of the cage, released by one of the officers. He adjusted his suit, but his gaze remained focused. "So now what?" the deputy sheriff asked. "The system will do its job now," Julian replied. "I'll make sure they get what they deserve." "You could have stopped it right away," Steve muttered as he was handcuffed. "You just wanted to destroy us." Julian looked at him, his eyes full of regret. "You destroyed yourself. I just let the truth come out." Steve was silent, realizing the gravity of his actions. Steve and Jack's story became a high-profile scandal. Their dismissal, arrest, and trial were in the news nationwide. The investigation uncovered numerous instances of their misconduct, which became the catalyst for a major audit of the entire police force in their precinct. Julian used his experience and authority to not only hold them accountable, but also to initiate reforms to prevent such incidents. But, even though it was fair, the story left a bitter residue. Sometimes it seems that justice and revenge go hand in hand, Julian told one of his colleagues as the case came to a close. But our job is to make sure the system works as it should. His words became a symbol of change, but questions still remained. How long would power remain in the hands of those unworthy of it? Where is the line between justice and personal retribution? The story of Steve, Jack, and Julian was a lesson to all who believe that power gives the right to humiliate and destroy lives. Power is a responsibility, and there's always a high price to pay for its abuse. We want to know your opinion about this story. Where do you think the line between power and its abuse lies? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is very important to us. We appreciate each of you and thank you for watching our content. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and give us a like if this topic resonated with you. We wish you a good day and justice in all things. Thank you for being with us.